Everybody, how you doing? Marc Ross, Ructions Radio. It's Friday, October 13th. Spooky. Dangerous. The world is dangerous. But joining us to clear it all out, our good friend, Gerald Ashley. Gerald, how are you? How's it going?
I'm fine. I'm not spooked by Friday the 13th. Spanish speakers or listeners may be interested or would remind us that in their calendar they worry about Tuesday the 13th. So it's not just everybody on Friday the 13th. And if you want to worry about something, you can always find something, but it doesn't seem very big worry to me. I shall avoid walking under ladders and things like that for the rest of the day, obviously. Other than that, I put a sweater on because the British summer is now over. It's not cold, it's just wet. And so I always give this weather report. It's very British and boring, but that's the state of play. And in many ways, over the last fortnight, nationally within the UK or within Europe, there's very little that's new. But obviously, as you know, we've got plenty of other things to talk about.
Oh my gosh, yes. We are back, Middle East, Israel, Hamas. It's all happening. One of the most horrific terrorist attacks we've seen in decades. But I'm certainly no Middle East expert. I find it quite complex and quite, shall I say, centuries old. I mean, some of these beefs go back centuries and, the geography, et cetera. But I'm really interested in two things. The intelligence failure. Hamas is reporting they've been working on this plot for over 2 years. How Israel missed it, how the U.S. missed it. Even I would say the U.K., the French. I mean, we're spending a lot of money on satellites, a lot of money on technology, walls, et cetera. Less human resources on the ground. And also I want to talk about the behavioral, the psychology of it, because the Israelis have really tried to make an effort to get more Palestinians involved in the economy, looking at it like our priorities, like if we can create their economy, that'll make them peaceful. And that seems to have gone awry. So I'm really interested in the intelligence failure. How did this happen? I mean, it literally is unthinkable. I mean, we were spending billions of dollars on tech, and it seems to not work.
I mean, it is interesting, isn't it? It was the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War in 1973. You would have thought that would have at least engendered some thought. Will somebody try some sort of spectacular event? I know spectacular is not really the right word to use. I think there were a number of spokesmen. I think there was a US government spokesman. I don't recall his name now. It wasn't Blinken. Somebody else who said a fortnight ago at a press conference how remarkably quiet the Middle East was. And in a way, you could say the organizational genius has been, on Hamas's point of view, evil genius, if you like, has been to put everybody to sleep, to think that, there is nothing going on. I agree with you about the Middle East. It is unbelievably complicated. I mean, we tend to think of it as just Arabs versus Israeli state or Jewish state or whatever. But of course, you've got Iran, which is a whole nother part of the exercise, and you've even got big inter-Arab rivalries. The Gulf states are not all on board in the same way. Some are cozying up to Iran, some are cozying up to Saudi Arabia. There's loads of talk about the Saudis and Israelis were getting close to some sort of deal, and maybe in a way this was what was needed to try and disrupt things. That's from an Iranian point of view. And then you've got this whole business of Egypt, who are terrified of the idea of having militant Islam back in Egypt, having had General Sisi, as he was, or now President Sisi, who seized control a number of years ago to kick out the Muslim Brotherhood. So followers of 3D chess have got all the components they need. But I think you do make a really interesting point. With all this information, why on earth was this not spotted? Is it complacency? I don't know. What one reads, second, maybe third hand, in the press that a lot of this information was kind of there, but nobody had joined the dots or put it together, which is remarkable because you make the point about the psychology of what's going on. The Israelis are famed for their approach to the psychology of warfare in many ways throughout the lifetime of the state of Israel. They've been punching above their weight. They've looked outnumbered on a number of sides, and they frequently come out on top. And a lot of that, I think, has been that they've been very good at reading the other side, and this time they haven't. Long-term consequences, Lord only knows, but it's. I'm never a big believer in we're on the edge of World War III. I know people always sort of go for the World War III thing. Life's never really quite that straightforward, is it? But it does open up an enormous series of problems all around. And I have to say, I think the United States looks, I wouldn't say helpless, that's not true, but they look slightly as a bemused outsider in all of this. Their links in the Middle East are clearly not as strong as they used to be, certainly on the Arab side.
Yeah, I'm struck by two things. The Hamas terrorists just using like paragliders, bulldozers, homemade munitions, to launch this attack, where the U.S. and even Rishi Sunak is sending, the Royal Navy, Biden is sending an aircraft carrier to the Eastern Med. These are multi-billion-dollar tools, and the Hamas terrorists were allowed to execute this with rudimentary gadgets. The asymmetrical approach to this is super interesting. The psychology, not having boots on the ground or in the streets, knowing complacency. It's a huge lesson, obviously, to learn. I mean, at the end of the day,
yeah, I
think it's going to be suggested
you
this was
raised that
preventable.
very important point. It was quite fashionable 10 or even 20 years ago to talk about asymmetric warfare. The sort of David versus Goliath, if we're going to start using biblical examples. And in a way, I have to say, what on earth is the point of getting the USS Gerald Ford 150 miles closer than it was last week? I mean, the planes could do it in 2 minutes anyhow. Okay, it's kind of a public signal, but who's the public signal to? Is it to the ordinary voter in Cincinnati or in Manchester or Paris or Lyon? I don't understand, other than is it a bureaucratic response? It's a fairly easy and straightforward thing to be seen to be doing something.
Well, it's a classic approach too, and that's, the government wants to be seen to be doing something, and frankly, all they can really do is send these ginormous toys. I don't want to say toys. I mean, they're obviously, amazing weapons of destruction, but, they're obviously not going to stop a paraglider. They're not going to stop a bulldozer and committed people that just want to plow through a fence. And
it's also
I just think, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, there's also got, certainly from a British and I think the French perspective, it's got a sort of part of our post-imperial delusion. We have this idea that if we send the Royal Navy to the Mediterranean, like a bunch of squabbling school kids, we'll sort it all out in 2 minutes flat. We couldn't have managed that in 1920s, let alone the 2020s. In fact, there's no history we've ever been able to imagine it. And one has to ask, some of these things seem a bit fruitless to me, to be honest.
I also, I obviously live in DC. I pass the Pentagon, nearly every day. And also, just from a commercial aspect, the military industrial complex of the US, the amount of money we're spending on high tech, AI, satellites, it appears none of this stuff works. At the end of the day, if you have a committed group of a few thousand people that want to cause havoc and harm, they're going to figure out a way to do it. Regardless how much money you spend, how much computer scientists you have, and just this over-reliance on technology, I think needs to be checked, because at the end of the day, if you're not in a cafe talking to people about what the hell is going on the ground, it doesn't matter how many satellites you have. I mean, it is really maddening to me.
Yeah, I mean, to give you a slightly wacko personal example, I remember looking at Google Maps, the sort of satellite photography, and picking up my very modest back garden or backyard, as you would call it. And to my astonishment, I used to have a white, pale blue, actually, pale, very, very light coloured round garden table, which 4 or 5 feet wide. Picked it up on Google Maps instantly. So, and that's at least 15 years ago. So, as you say, it's very peculiar that guys are running around with bulldozers and all the rest of it, and somehow building missiles somewhere. Okay, they can do a lot of this under cover of buildings and maybe in tunnels and all the rest of it, but it's a humongous effort to do all of that. But it does show, I think the key phrase you use is over reliance on technology. Um,
It's absolutely shocking. And then
in loads of
once,
areas, it's almost Western thinking, isn't it?
yeah,
We think, oh, well, technology is going to solve all the problems of financial crises because we've got all these e- economic models and financial models that will run things. But
we just need more data. That'll find the answer.
yeah, in fact, I think we're drowning in data. You see that paradoxically, that may be the problem. That there is so much stuff to sift through. There is so much stuff to potentially look at, and whatever you look at, there'll be some sort of smart guy will say, oh yes, but it might be a black swan, so we've got to look at really unusual ideas as well. I think you can just be chasing your tail, and maybe that's what's happened in this case.
The second other tragic thing is the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces response, which seemed very inadequate. It took hours to get to the quote unquote battlefield, which seems also completely unacceptable. I don't like Israel's not that big of a country. They have a full-time standing army. Some bases were ransacked. I mean, I like the intelligence and military response failure is catastrophic, obviously, and it's really launched ourselves into a situation where we don't really know the end game. So I'm watching for that.
I mean, it does smack maybe in a way. It we'll have to see what comes out in time, but you think back to the Yom Kippur War, which became very static and staring either side over the Suez Canal. And the Egyptians came up with the idea of spraying high pressure water hoses to wash away sand embankments and things. And that was an immediate shock as well. But to me, this is a bigger shock, actually. Not in military terms, but in just the fact that it was executed like this. Because it begs the obvious question, what's going to be the next one?
Right. And you would think with more equipment and scarier weapons, it could be horrific. Anyways, I don't want to, it's going to be fascinating to watch. Obviously, it's going to play out. But for me, like the intelligence aspect of it and the lack of response quickly is lessons learned, not only military, politically, but also for business.
And
go ahead.
It does play into this idea of asymmetric warfare. And, maybe 2023 will be the year that we say that's it for the tank. I think if I've got my history right, the tank emerged in 1917. It was a code word because we didn't A, know what to call it, and B, we didn't want to tip anybody off. So somebody came up with the idea of calling it a tank. Initially, they were fairly successful, but they weren't very reliable. But the interesting thing about tanks was that they only work in mobile warfare. And so both the Germans very famously, and actually also the Russians made great use in the Second World War of vast mobile tank armies. They're not very good in the static situation. We saw some Palestinian drones damage or destroy, I think, at least 2 Israeli tanks. And of course, this is exactly what's going on in Ukraine. It's only, a couple of months ago, we were assured that, well, when the Ukrainians get the Leopard tank and then they're going to get the British Challenger, and boy, look out if they get the US Abrahams as well, all of this will it'll be a big game changer. Well, as far as I can see, I know so far it's only mainly the German and a few British tanks have made it to Ukraine. They're being royally hit by drones. So again, the nature of warfare it seems to be changing, and it maybe it's just swinging away from high tech. It's to almost a low tech, smart approach. Seems to be the way.
Well, there's such a desire to build big things. I mean, an aircraft carrier is a beautiful thing. It's an amazing piece of equipment. It is ginormous. It employs a lot of people. It sends a big message, but a drone is a lethal weapon now too. And I don't know, the psychology of this is really going to be sorted out. And I think, the generals going to be held to task, military, the intelligence failure across the world. A lot of people have got egg on their face this morning.
Yeah, I should think a lot of military handbooks are getting rewritten all over the place from the events of the last couple of years. And my other bugbear, which I always go on about, and God forbid it happens, but do we really believe that the aircraft carrier is such a smart idea anymore? I mean, to me, they just seem staggeringly vulnerable. They're useful in low level conflicts. So if you want to use them against smaller countries for some purpose of creating an air bridge or an area of aerial control. But the idea that you really are going to go up against China with some aircraft carriers seems completely mad to me.
Well, and also, mines, right? I mean, let's talk about just mines. I mean, they're completely autonomous, simple weapon, highly destructive, not politically fashionable. But you imagine if there are more mines ringing Gaza, does this situation happen? And that also chooses the psychology of like, what's the proper weapon? Is this a just weapon? That's also an interesting thing because that's a simple device and it doesn't, I don't know how many mines you could buy for the cost of an aircraft carrier, but it's got to be a staggering number.
It's going to be an interestingly large number, I would have thought.
Let's talk about, to me, the pullout of Afghanistan. The Team Biden pulling out the troops of Afghanistan. A year later we have Ukraine. A year later we have Israel, Hamas. I don't know. Is the West asleep? Or is this pullback sensible? Is it too early to tell? I mean, are these things all connected? What's your sense?
Well, I think again, we if we use a big broad sweep of history, which can be dangerous, we've had a sort of Pax Americana from 1945. If you like nice sort of round numbers, it's been 75 years until 2020, and it's become increasingly hard work, not to say expensive, for the American economy to act as the world policeman. I mean, you could go as far back as the Vietnam War was the first sign that the United States could not afford these endless wars. Think of the number of foreign wars the US has been involved in, or even the French and British for that matter, since 1945. They have precious little to show for it, as far as I can see. And they've got through an enormous amount of money. I mean, not least of which, and I know it seems like ancient history now, but in 1971, an ounce of gold was $32, and it's 1,850 now. And it has been nearly 2,000. So that's kind of telling us something. But I mean, in a more focused way, I just don't think the West can afford all of this stuff anymore. I mean, there is absolutely no way Britain could put a meaningful army into the Middle East in the way it did during certainly the first Iraq War or even the second one. I mean, we do not have the manpower, the kit, the equipment, all the money to do this sort of stuff. And also people turn around and say, well, actually, what the hell are we doing there? And now I know, and I think a lot of people were shocked when, and I think everybody was shocked when Biden said, actually, we're pulling out of Afghanistan. This is completely mad. And people said, well, it'll be a big humanitarian issue and the way women are treated and girls aren't educated and all the other stuff that goes with it, and a brutal regime. But, I think of the 19th century British politician and Prime Minister Lord Palmerston, who rather brutally said that countries don't have permanent friends, they only have permanent interests. and what is the West interest in a lot of these countries, particularly the way the energy balance is all changing. We're not in 1974 where the Saudis can just say, well, we're jacking up the price of oil fourfold and bring everybody into line. It's a much more nuanced picture now, I think.
Yeah, I always get back to the psychology of it because, we could talk about the money spent, the lives lost, the treasure, etc. But we only know what happened because of history. Like, we don't know what would happen if Vietnam doesn't happen. We don't know. If Korea doesn't happen. If we're still in Afghanistan, we don't happen. So there's always that psychology of there's that phrase in America, Monday morning quarterbacking. Or what if? But we don't. All we really know is what we know, right? So there's that debate around it, and then the energy, trade, commerce, empires, all these issues. We may not be on the verge of World War III, but we're definitely on the verge of something new. Like, something is happening. Like, something is unleashing, coming forward. There's a change happening.
I just think maybe we're in a long period of relative decline, and which is maybe it's bad timing to be around now. But it was self-evidently the West is not as powerful it was, I don't think, even from say 25 years ago, and certainly not from 50 years ago. We're in that old phrase, we're unable to hold the ring, and whether other people will fill the gap, I think is equally moot. But it's just going to be a much more messy, less controlled situation as far as the major Western economies are concerned.
And you are right. It was a very all or nothing kind of situation. I always famously think about World War II, and that was the first time that foreign, the Allies, if you will, actually invaded, Berlin and tracked down the Nazis and killed Hitler and all this. I mean, I always think Churchill was in Hitler's bunker, which I find absolutely fascinating. Most wars are just fought. They rechange the lines, but now we're entering this all or nothing kind of situation. And I don't know, maybe the great powers of the world need to give up more power to keep the peace. I don't know, maybe the new models of the old models, if you will, as you said, sending in colonial powers or sending in a big battleship to kind of sort out a messy neighborhood. Those days are over, and we got to find a better way to operate in this world. And maybe it's going to involve giving up more power in the West.
Whether we like it or not, I think is the situation. What it does mean is that, and we've talked about it on this show many times, the need to create all these sort of multilateral networks and alliances that have got to, give a more flexible response at a local level. If you said to American admirals in the 1960s and 1970s, you're going to actually need Japan to help support the Pacific Fleet, I mean, I think you're completely mad. Apart from which, the Japanese had no real naval assets, and that's changing. So a lot of all this stuff is changing. And we always about every few months we always mention Tim Marshall. We always give Tim Marshall a plug for his books on the geography of politics and economics. And again, the geographic tensions are absolutely embedded into all of this. And I just think maybe, as I said earlier, it's a post-imperial thing. We kind of got to get used to the idea that we can't just rush halfway around the world and sort out a local street fight. It's not, the world just isn't like that anymore.
Well, let's talk to something more fun, less complicated. The UK conference season is over. Keir Starmer is on the verge of taking over number 10. And here in the US, the House of Representatives, run by the Republicans, have entered the absolute clown show level of government. Do you want to lead off, explain to what's happening in either DC or London?
I think for a number of years, it's safe to say that nobody watches the party conferences. Only obsessives and probably those that are insane do so.
Well, headbangers, right? I love when you use the word headbangers.
Well,
political nerds and headbangers.
So poor was the response of the Tory conference, the Conservative Party conference this year, they reckon at least 100 MPs didn't even bother to turn up. Because these things are mind-numbingly boring. And also, I think it's a little bit like when you see a magic trick that's done very badly. Once you can see how it's done, or a ventriloquist where you can see their lips move, I think the British public, and I think it may be true in the United States, are kind of fed up with all of this. I can write the next winner's speech for you now. We've been shocked. We've been shocked to find that there's less money. We're going to have to go through all the books very carefully. But don't worry, because I've got a broad new fantastic vision, blah, 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 blah. And I think people have become so cynical that they don't take a lot of notice of it. I'm so cynical, I'm now promoting the idea that there's really two interchangeable leaders, which is Keir Sunak and Rishi Starmer. I mean, does it matter who's? I don't think it matters two hoots which of them is there, to be honest. But there's a serious element to that, and the serious element is it's because the big stuff nobody seems to be able to either tackle or even want to try to tackle it. So we've had the slightly bizarre idea that you're going to have to stop. I don't quite understand this stopping smoking rule, that if you're born after a certain date, you can't smoke, but before a date, you can. Well, I mean, that's just nonsense on legs. And the idea that with 1 year to a general election, the British government is going to try and fiddle around with the most important high school examinations that would take a 5 to 7 year view to get it organized seems completely mad as well. And I'm very much taken by your comment a couple of weeks ago that Mr. Biden's very exercised about ticket prices at the theatre. I mean, in a way, doesn't this show the impotence of what's going on here? That nobody's prepared to tackle the big stuff because either they think they'll frighten the electorate, or it's just too hard. And so I think, Mr. Sunak is down to a 20% approval rating, his lowest ever, the lowest for anybody ever. So that's some sort of record. Mr. Starmer can't get too excited by it because he's bubbling under at about 29 or something equally horrendous. And of course, the big winner in all of this is none of the above. The big winner in British politics is anybody but all this lot. So there we are.
Yeah, the rise of the independent voter in the US, actually people who registered independent, not picking a party, is increasing every year. In fact, in California, which is heavily Democratic, heavily blue state, the biggest party is independents. That is like, no, they want neither party, which is saying something. They're not fully sold on being a Republican for various reasons, but they're also like this other lot. The Democrats are equally appealing. In fact, getting back to junk fees, this week, while the world is on fire, Biden rolls out to the Rose Garden and announces new Federal Trade Commission rules to ban charging hidden fees. I mean, this was literally on the thing to do list this week, and to show the full price up front. It's amazing the small ball politics of this stuff when, serious stuff is happening.
Is some of this driven by focus groups where they think there are a few marginal people in marginal seats that would just swing it? So although it's complete nonsense, we'll make an announcement. Is it that?
It's 100%, yeah, driven by focus groups. I mean, the minutia, the smallness of it only lends itself to a handful of people in Illinois saying this is the right thing to do to get suburban soccer moms who take their daughters to Taylor Swift concerts. I mean that's the direction we're facing.
I think both interesting and potentially worrying aspect is there's no emergence of a catalyst to pull all the independents together. There's no, California doesn't have an independent candidate who would sort of pull all these disparate people together. I say that could be worrying because if it's the wrong sort of person, it could be quite alarming. But there's
Well,
no
also the
sign.
nature, the nature of our system, not being a parliamentary system, it's a winner take all. It really lends itself to a two-party system. In fact, the parties have really bolted themselves on into the system to dictate the electoral process. So running as an independent is, you can do it, but it is really, really hard to win. Even if you were to get enough people,
Ross
the logistics
Perot,
behind it.
I suppose Ross Perot is the last one who came anywhere near seriously upsetting things.
Correct.
One question I was going to ask you: what's going to happen to Mr. Kennedy and his announcement? Is he going anywhere or going nowhere?
Well, he's going to run as an independent, which is great. But the challenge is you've got to get on the ballot. So every state has different rules. You need so many signatures. Some do it by county, some do it by congressional district, some just do it at large. So just the logistics, you have to have some kind of on-the-ground situation where people are literally filling out forms. Whereas if you're in the party, as I said, they've bolted on. So if you win the Democrat convention in Nebraska, you're on the ballot statewide, right? That doesn't exist if you run as an independent. So logistically, it's super hard. It's unlikely he's going to be on all 50 states. But in the states he does get on, he's going to pull votes, presumably from both sides. And he's a big name. So, we're looking at guys that are winning the White House by a few thousand votes in every key state. You get somebody in there like Kennedy.
So do we have another cliffhanger in terms of the voting when in terms of the result, maybe?
I think for sure. And I think it just, we're just in this weird period where it's just a mishmash of people. I mean, there's no reason Kennedy should be running. I mean, I have no idea what he's going to do to save America. But there's such a disdain for both Biden and Trump that any kind of headbanger getting in there, creating some noise, getting good press, big name, is going to cause enough of a distraction that, once again, you can't really game out how to play out the election if you're running these campaigns. But it's not good. I mean, I think what's interesting, getting back to Israel, that there's this idea of like luxury beliefs, right? Or you have so much peace and prosperity that you can start worrying about the judiciary or the Constitution. And in many ways in the States, like we have so much peace and prosperity relative that we're dabbling on these like really trivial issues like junk fees or just like random stuff, as opposed to really if we really care about climate, if we really care about energy policy, infrastructure, big decisions like that, you need like a huge coalition, and nobody's really interested in that. And I think because we haven't been forced to. And what's interesting, getting back to Israel, 2 weeks ago they're talking about the judiciary. Bibi Netanyahu's got a cabinet basically there to protect them. This event's happened on Saturday. The whole world changes. They got a coalition government now, and they're on the war footing. So things can happen quickly, but not gaming that out or just playing small is not great.
I think I'm still holding to the view that the general election in the UK next year is almost a waste of time. It looks increasingly well, it's probably a waste. It doesn't really matter who wins, but it will be Mr. Starmer's turn or Sir Keir Starmer's turn.
I'm interested
he
to see
will
what
just be a complete carbon copy of Rishi. You will not notice any difference at all.
Well, what about the television broadcast?
There'll be a lot of grandstanding nonsense in speeches, but nothing much will change.
Well, the TV. I'm excited for the TV studio, the BBC swing. Well, you have the swingmometer, or
the swingometer or whatever.
Yeah. What kind of exciting graphics will Sky News?
It'll be kind of right over. You won't be able to.
Imagine. I know. Just it is interesting. Why drag it out? I mean, I guess there's really no way to force. Is there a parliamentary way to force Rishi to call the election? I mean,
well, only if a vote of confidence.
Yeah.
Which is what happened to Jim Callaghan in 1979. He lost a vote of confidence in the House.
And that's I guess a majority vote, or is that a super majority vote?
Had a majority of 2 or something, and it was only needed somebody to be ill and somebody to be, locked in the lavatory or whatever. All these sort of crazy things that happened. I mean, they even used to, in the 70s at one stage, they were bringing MPs in on trolleys from hospital to vote. I mean, that's how insane the whole thing was. Because
we're facing
incredibly tight.
Yeah, and here in the House of Representatives, so Steve Scalise won the conference vote on, I guess, Wednesday, and then by Thursday he pulled out. So the House the government, the Congress cannot work if there's not a speaker. Now, after 2001, during 9/11, they passed this rule about a speaker pro tem.
Yeah.
In case like the entire government was decapitated, because the speaker actually is the third ranking government official. If the president and vice president were to be decapitated, the speaker of the House would take over.
Yeah.
So they put in this rule about the speaker pro tem, which is great, but we've never had this rule before. And nobody really knows what this person can do. Like, can he actually bring up legislation? Can he actually do stuff? So even if Patrick McHenry, who's the speaker pro tem right now, decided to say bring legislation to pass funding for Ukraine or Taiwan or something like that, they would challenge it legally. They would say you've got no power, and of course, then we've got a judicial crisis.
This reminds me of there used to be a journalist in the Daily Telegraph, I think in the 1980s, called Patrick Hutber, and he was quite an acidic parliamentary sketch writer, I believe, and he had something called Hutber's Law, which has made it to Wikipedia. And Hutber's Law was that any perceived improvement in any arrangement is always a deficiency. And so actually going around trying to improve things all the time is not always, in terms of process, particularly if it's been well established for a couple of hundred years, is not a good idea. And we're suffering from this in the UK, thanks to Mr. Blair's endless reforms of everything. If a wretched man had just left everything alone, things would be much more straightforward. He is, of course, the government in waiting as well. I think I've pointed this out before. We shall have all the usual suspects will suddenly reappear on the scene. That's next year.
Two things on Tony Blair. I assume if you wouldn't have reformed the House of Lords, you would already be in there. And secondly, I assume Blair knows all the secret passageways into number 10. So he'll just sneak in, right, around the press, hit the tunnel.
You've been watching too many Netflix shows.
He'll just pop up and
need to.
I'm here, Keir. Let's go to work.
He doesn't need to. He's almost at the stage of they come to him.
Well, speaking, I don't know, a really good transition. I want to talk about energy policy. There was a huge deal announced this week. ExxonMobil buying Pioneer Natural Resources, $60 billion. It's the largest purchase of Exxon since they purchased Mobil, I guess in the 90s, during the crazy leveraged buyout days, and huge deal. But what's interesting about this is a pure play shale deal, right? Pioneer, Permian Basin, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, shale. So two things. Obviously, fossil fuels aren't going anywhere, right? Shale continues to be a huge power source, natural gas. And I guess three, the geopolitics of it, right? Because once again, one of the biggest American companies ever committing more to natural resources in North America and the United States, not going around the world. And we're entering the winter season. Before we got on here, we're talking about how Qatar is going to be supplying gas to the UK. Interesting week for energy policy.
And this is against the background of huge lobbying by the ESG lobby that we've got to get out of fossil fuels and everything. And of course, as you know, there's been a big pushback against that by some of the states who are controlling pension funds and state money and all the rest of it. And I actually think ESG has peaked, and we're getting back to the reality that we're going to be using fossil fuels probably for another 50, 75 years. That's the sheer reality of it. And also the other reality of all of this, people keep going on about, it's gasoline or petrol in cars, but there's the whole plastics industry. There's the fertilizer industry. We can't feed people without crude oil. And so I think some of these ideas that we're just going to go and live in a cave and knit ourselves nice thick jumpers like I'm wearing, it's not remotely sensible. And I think big oil always gets it in the neck, but then they kind of know that. It kind of goes with the territory. And I think they're just right the punches. And so what happens now, suddenly they're big mega mergers, and there's obviously a lot of capital flowing in. So this idea that we're going to have stranded assets and people are going to pull capital out of that area, I think is wrong. I think it's, fossil fuels are here for a long time to come.
I'm with you on the same page. I think Exxon's dabbling. It's interesting now they call themselves. They moved away from this idea of they're an oil company. They've been calling themselves a natural gas or natural resources company. But yeah, just the amount of petroleum or oil or carbon, whatever you want to say, that is necessary in our daily lives. Like just like any kind of surgery you're having, plastic tubing, that's all chemistry. It's all coming from a barrel of
Well,
oil,
also,
and we can't discount that.
Watch what people do, not what they say. And if you look around the world, we are consuming more fossil fuels than ever. We're consuming more this year than last year and than the year before. So all this idea that it's all going to end in 5 years' time, or 10 years, depending which politician you choose to rather unwisely believe, it's all nonsense. And I mean that is one little bit of difference between maybe Starmer and Sunak, is that the Tory party have woken up to the idea that a lot of these green policies are very popular until people have to pay for them. And funny that when people suddenly have to pay, they're not quite so keen. And we've got lots of mini examples of this starting to come along, but with a lot of huge examples coming down the road over the next 5-10 years. And so I think this is going to be, that may be where there is a big political battle, but not yet.
Yeah, I do wonder, getting back to the energy policy, because today, actually, it's coming out 11 a.m. here in the beautiful city of Alexandria, Virginia. President Biden and Jennifer Granholm, who's the energy secretary, are going up to Philadelphia to announce hydrogen, a $7 billion investment. They're building 7 terminals. Port of Philadelphia is going to get one of these. So the U.S. government, it's interesting. We talked about hydrogen the last time we were on here. But it's interesting, maybe with the ExxonMobil stuff, this hydrogen commitment, Rishi Sunak saying, hey, we're going to start drilling more oil. I don't know. Maybe this does give cover, and it's a realistic situation that, hey, people.
I suppose you could say that hydrogen, $7 billion is kind of peanuts at one level.
Well, that is a good point. Like, I have no idea. I'm sure it's I'm sure it's like seed money.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, I wouldn't sniff at being given $7 billion, but I think, and again, I think we said this before, that it's going to be a mix of things, and we've got these people who are like anti-nuclear, or they hate coal, or they hate oil, or it must be wind, or the only way forward is solar, etc., etc. The truth of the matter is, it's going to be a portfolio mix. Now, that portfolio mix may change over time, and the most efficient way to do that would be to let the market decide. The least efficient way to do it would be a bunch of grandstanding politicians who come up with wacko ideas that haven't been properly costed. And at the moment, we're having loads of wacko ideas from particularly British politicians, I'm sure it's true in the United States, where nobody has the slightest idea of what the implications for efficiency and costs are. And, it's nonsense.
Speaking of the market, I meant to share this with you. There's a nuclear plant in Michigan, the Great Lakes state. There's a Florida-based energy company that is looking to restart this nuclear plant. This would be the first reopening of a shutdown commercial nuclear plant in the United States. So there again, as you talk, we need a suite of tools. The market is speaking. They realize, listen, we have this existing infrastructure. Why are we shutting this stuff down?
It's an incredibly green energy source. And the idea that you can, as the Germans have done, a dismissing nuclear, well, that's working well. They dismissed nuclear. Now they're having to knock down wind farms to dig up coal to generate the electricity. I mean, which genius thought of this? Well, of course, the truth is nobody's thought it through again. And we're back to Mr. Sunak fiddling around with who can smoke a cigarette and President Biden deciding what the price of a theatre ticket should be, because nobody is looking at these big long-term strategic objectives. Or they take one look at them and think, oh, they're too hard, don't want to do it.
Well, the upside of decommissioning and then recommissioning is you get double the bite of the GDP apple. So
Well, there you go.
That's some smart, right? We're stimulating the best economic policy I think the United States could do is build a canal from Baltimore to Santa Monica, right? And then then refill in that same canal from Santa Monica to Baltimore. I mean, that is like some good GDP stimulation.
I think one last one last thought on this is I think California is very interesting because I think California is the poster child for doing everything wrong in energy policy. I mean, they are the absolute Olympic champions. And everybody who keeps saying, oh, all the Californian ideas are fantastic and brilliant and it's a new dawn and a new world, well, let them get on with it. And if it works, we'll join them 5 or 10 years later. I see, I wouldn't necessarily want to be first at making, joining in, making all their mistakes. So there we are. That's my view.
Good tacos in California, though.
Hmm?
Good tacos in California. So
well, that's something, but they are available elsewhere, I believe.
That is good, though. All right, let's get into what we're reading and watching.
Well,
do you want to go first?
We've had a big blast of politics, and I'm afraid there's more to come. I was wandering around, not entirely aimlessly, on Wimbledon Common last weekend, sort of taking a bit of a stroll.
As you do.
To my surprise, there was a pop-up charity bookshop.
Were you wearing a bowler hat? Were you wearing a bowler hat?
No, not quite. And I find bookshops incredibly dangerous places. I rarely manage to get out without buying far too many books that I may not read, or I think I will read and then eventually don't. But I did buy one, and I started it on it straight away, and I found it absolutely gripping. And it's here we are. It's the Diaries of Alan Clark. Now you have to be of a certain vintage and knowledge of British politics to really understand who Alan Clark is. He's a very aristocratic background, incredibly wealthy, not necessarily the most pleasant individual on the planet. He certainly had a very colourful background, not least of which running off with other men's wives. But he has written a diary that is really, I think, fascinating on the inside workings of the Thatcher administration. So it's from the mid to late 80s through into the mid 90s. I think there's other volumes. I think I may actually have the middle volume here. And it does help if you know who a lot of these individuals are, many of whom are around or just sort of falling asleep in the House of Lords these days. But it also explains the minutiae of government. And it's slightly depressing in that a lot of it is exactly the same. So there was a lot of rushing round to pointless photo opportunities because it was thought that the number 10 PR department thought it would be good. He was constantly being pestered to be in the local press, not so much the national press, but the party wanted him to be sort of opening garden fetes and kissing babies and all this stuff. And it's just clearly nothing has changed. And he writes very well, and he writes with quite an acidic sort of turn of phrase and humor. So it's actually a very entertaining book. But to be honest, you do need to be interested in British politics of a certain era. But I must say I'm enjoying it quite a lot. In terms of what I'm watching, again, I always seem to be the guy who's sort of stuck in the past. And on this show, you do all the future stuff, and I do all the stuff that's gone beyond or before, rather. And I've been watching a Netflix documentary. It's just one; it's not a series, on the Iranian embassy siege in 1980, and that became famous because it sort of. This was a point where Mrs. Thatcher said, "Look, we don't negotiate with terrorists. That's it, full stop." And the SAS got involved, and I always thought all the hijackers, or whatever we want to call them, were killed. Quite remarkably, and I make of this what you will, One of them survived, was tried, was sent to jail, and under human rights laws couldn't be extradited back to Iran, and lives under a pseudonym somewhere in South London. Now, how extraordinary is that? Even more extraordinary, I found, was that because at the time maybe I didn't take a great deal of notice of the politics and everything, these guys, in a way, were the sort of the goodies. They were the guys who were trying to rise up against this dreadful regime in Tehran. But they misread the situation, and Mrs. Thatcher wasn't going to stand. She wasn't just going to let them get on a plane and fly out of Heathrow and all the rest of it. And so it all ended very badly. But it's like a lot of these things, when you know the detail, it's a much more nuanced story than just that 10-minute bit of film on the news. So the show is called 6 Days, and it was a 6-day siege, and it's on Netflix.
Yeah, I need to check that out. What's that relation to like the troubles in Northern Ireland? Was that before, or after, or during, or do you think that played? And then do you think that played into Thatcher's thinking about how
very
she handled
much of that era, and it's also maybe a not very subtle signal that the British are quite happy to go and shoot people. And if you really start taking on the British state, we won't roll over. And I think in that pretty much has been the view now of most Western governments since. One or two have sometimes slightly rolled over, but in general, you take on the United States, or you take on France or Germany, even, or wherever, they're going to come after you, and that's probably served us well in terms of fewer events. But it was the other aspect to it was it was effectively televised.
Yeah.
Because it was, there were TV camera crews 100 yards away, and they caught quite a lot of the action live. And so that's why it's a more vivid example, perhaps.
Yeah, as we started too, I was just thinking about the hostage situation we have, in Gaza right now. I mean, that's.
But it just strikes me as remarkable that somewhere wandering around as a guy in his 60s, maybe he's doing his shopping this afternoon in South London, and he was one of the hijackers. Extraordinary.
Maybe we can get him on the podcast. All right, I'm going to Simon Winchester. This is a book. He's quite prolific. He's a British journalist. I think he lives in Massachusetts now, but he writes. I don't know. He's probably written a dozen books. I've read several of his books. This one's on the Pacific. He has one on the Atlantic. What I like about, they're about history, obviously, but they're written in like vignette style. So each chapter is an independent story that leads to, what do I want to say? A separate story that leads to a bigger story, if you will.
Right.
But talks about the ocean, the economy, nuclear testing, transistor radio, Sony. I don't know. They're fun little books, good history. He's quite prolific. Something to check out. I will famously say I watched Pax on Netflix. What's interesting is my wife started watching it first, and I'm a huge soccer fan. I'm a huge Man U fan, so I'm well aware of Bex and Beckham and all the silliness and the whole drama. But she came from it from a pop culture perspective, Victoria Beckham, and I don't know. It's been interesting to see now how entertainment, sports, pop culture, documentaries, Netflix, all this stuff is coming back, and I don't know. It's pretty entertaining. I think if you know most of that time period, I think it's also interesting is kind of like the rise of like the celebrity athlete. I think Beckham was at the forefront of that, and I don't know. Interesting documentary.
Yeah, I think
he has a lovely house in the countryside, and he's done quite well for himself.
It's a big theme, isn't it? As we talked before, the emergence of this sort of whole new global sports economy, that the amount of money that is now can be accessed by selling stuff direct to interested fans who've got money to spend. In that similar vein, I'm watching the World Cup, the Rugby Union World Cup at the moment, and it's the quarterfinals this weekend. So we're kind of getting down to the more kind of very much the serious end of who potentially win. And I get the feeling that rugby union might be one of these sports that will now start to attract more and more money in the future. And it always cheers you up when I say I have to be impressed by Monsieur Macron, because the French handling of an organisation of the games looks very good. They had a tiny glitch, I think, with tickets on the very first game, but they've organised it over half a dozen venues with, I don't know exactly how many matches it is. It must be 30 or 40 matches now, and it's all gone without a single hitch. And so that must presage well for the Paris Olympics next year, I guess.
Do you have a prediction who's going to make the Final Four?
It may be that the semi-finals are almost more interesting than who the final is. We've got some good quarterfinals coming up. If I was to say who I think might win, I think it'll either be New Zealand or Ireland. And New Zealand were a bit off the boil, but suddenly have come back. It won't. I'm afraid I don't think it will be England. But that famous last words. But it's of an extraordinarily high level, high quality. And in the same way, I was droning on during the summer about the insanity of the Tour de France and just the sheer level of expertise and organisation and everything. And that's showing through in this last sort of 8 teams, or certainly last 4. It's very difficult to pick out anyone that would, there's no definite clear favourite, put it that way.
Well, it's interesting too. I'm looking at the final 8 here: Wales, Ireland, Fiji. I mean, these aren't huge population centers. Certainly Fiji. And then in the final 8, it's pretty wild that you just need to find 11 good players. You don't need like 1,000 good players.
I mean,
you find 11 good players, you can make a good run at this.
Where's the United States? I mean, But do you see the growth opportunity? Because there's no. I mean, Japan has a pretty good side, but there's no Chinese rugby, as far as I know. Maybe not even played at all. But there are emerging nations out there: Argentina, Georgia. Very entertaining, though they didn't do desperately well. Portugal, and even places like Chile. So there are. It seems to be it's becoming a global sport, I think, now. To be honest.
Well, also tomorrow, I guess India and Pakistan playing cricket, which is quite unprecedented. So
yeah,
there's that too. Big sports day tomorrow. All right, Gerald, good chatting with you, buddy. Hopefully, we'll be back together in 2 weeks. What a crazy time! It'd be interesting to see if I don't know, more battleships going to the Middle East.
Well, yeah, and to what effect? But we shall see. Okay, take care.
Ciao.
Tell you what we didn't mention.